Tantor Audio, a division of recorded books, presents Korea, A New History of South and North, by Victor Cha and Ramon Pacheco Pardo, narrated by Julian. Note on the Korean text. Romanization of the Korean language has long suffered from a lack of a single, agreed-upon standard for spelling, which is why you will variously see Kim Jong-il, Kim Jong-il, and Kim Chong-il in the press and academic publications. The book at hand uses something of a mishmash of different standardized romanization techniques. For names and places that will be familiar to many listeners, such as Kim Il-sung, Kim Dae-jung, and Pyongyang, revised romanization is used. For names of people and places less familiar to the casual observer, revised romanization is mostly employed, with some use of McCune-Reischauer romanization. And for those who aren't acquainted with Korean, Chinese, or Japanese names, it bears pointing out that in nearly all cases, with the exception of a few whose names are widely known and or used in the reverse order, such as Syngman Rhee, Korean, Chinese and Japanese names are written in their traditional order, with the surname first and the given name last. Introduction. In 2007, Victor Cha found himself in a Black Hawk helicopter flying from the Demilitarized Zone, DMZ, that separates North and South Korea, to the capital city of Seoul for a meeting with then-President Roh Moo-hyun. He was returning from a few days of negotiations with counterparts in North Korea as a member of the National Security Council staff at the White House, and was to brief the South Korean president about the meetings. It was his first trip to North Korea. He had not gone to the country as an academic. Being hosted in a VIP guest house and chauffeured to and from meetings, Victor was struck by the orderliness and cleanliness of the capital city of Pyongyang. Though the buildings and infrastructure of the city seemed dated by a few decades due to North Korea's stagnant economy, life certainly looked livable. It was only when his handlers drove Victor from Pyongyang to the DMZ for his return trip to the south that he saw the true squalor of the country. Bar a couple of military vehicles, there were no cars on the road during the hours-long drive. Barren fields on both sides of the highway boasted no evidence of mechanized farming, only an occasional oxen plough and some machine gun nests. Just visible from the car were distant apartment buildings in the city of Kaesong, North Korea's second-largest metropolis. They lacked windows, adorned only with tarp to protect from the elements of early spring. Boarding the military chopper on the southern side of the DMZ, his control officer handed Victor a schedule of meetings for the day, but as he stared at the piece of paper, he could not get these parting images of North Korea out of his head. Within a few minutes of takeoff, the travelling party flew over a sprawling factory complex. Victor asked what it was, and the control officer told him it was one of Samsung Electronics' factories, prolific producer of high-end phones, HD TVs, and consumer appliances owned by households around the world. They then came within sight of the densely packed, gleaming skyscrapers of downtown Seoul. A colleague once described Seoul as a 24-hour global city not unlike New York. Victor had seen the skyline of the city many times before, of course, but not after having just spent time in North Korea. His immediate thought was that the windowless buildings in Kaesong and the state-of-the-art structures in the south were both built and occupied by Koreans, the same Koreans, compatriots who were divided not by any choices of their own. How did this happen? What circumstances led the same people to live in such starkly different conditions? There are no genetic differences between the Koreans in the north and the Koreans in the south to account for this disparity of development. Is this what politics can do to people and to a country? The story of Korea is unique and original, for Korea has a long and rich history, The mythical foundation of the country dates back to 2333 BCE, when Dangung established Gojoseon, Old Joseon. Today, both North and South Korea celebrate Gaetanjeol, National Foundation Day, on October the 3rd to commemorate Dangung's establishment of the country. This, of course, is a legend. But the proto-states that eventually resulted in the creation of Korea do date back millennia. Along with its neighbors, China and Japan, Korea can credibly claim to be one of the oldest countries in the world. From 57 BCE until 668, the kingdoms of Goguryeo, Shilla, and Baekje occupied the whole of the Korean peninsula and parts of Manchuria. This was the Three Kingdoms period. Shilla then unified these kingdoms, as well as most of the Korean peninsula, under its rule. This was the start of the northern and southern states era, with Balhae in the north and Shilla in the south. This period would end in 935. It would be followed by the first kingdom that unified the whole of the Korean peninsula, Goryeo, which would last until 1392. In 1392, Taizhou of Joseon took power and established the Joseon dynasty. The dynasty would go on to rule Korea until 1910, a period of over 500 years that inevitably left an imprint in modern Korea. Confucianism became the official religion and determined the way in which life was organized, with clear divisions between rulers and ruled, men and women, parents and children, and elder and junior. Today, the legacy of Confucianism still affects the politics and society of North and South Korea. Also, during the Joseon era, Korea had to fend off periodic invasion, or at least intervention, attempts by China and Japan. Today, the two Koreas still strive to forge their own path independent of the influence of external powers. And under the Joseon dynasty, Korean culture flourished to levels unseen previously. This culture continues to influence the South Korean movies, dramas and pop songs that the world has learned to love. In this book, we focus on Korea's modern history, a period roughly covering the late 19th century up to the third decade of the 21st century. The two of us have decades of accumulated experience researching, teaching and talking about Korea and the two Koreas into which the country is divided today. We have also worked for or supported the work of government. Thanks to these experiences, we have had access to policymakers, politicians, civil society leaders, academics and researchers from South and North Korea. Our innate curiosity and family circumstances have also given us access to regular folks, especially in South Korea, but also, within limits, in the North. This book stems from all these experiences. Take the case of Ramon Pacheco Pardo, the co-author of this book, who hails from a country that historically has had limited interest in Korea, or the rest of the Asian continent for that matter. When Ramon first announced that he was to move to South Korea, his friends organized a farewell party. These friends went around bookstores and searched on the internet for days and days so that they could gift him a book to better understand the country he was going to be moving to. It has to be said, it was a labor of love and friendship for which Ramon will always be grateful. His friends ended up finding two relevant books, a South Korea tourist guide book and a book nominally about North Korea that was as much about China. That was the state of interest about South Korea in his country back then. 20 years later, K-pop bands ATEEZ, Blackpink and Monster X have filled out stadiums in Ramon's home country of Spain. Family, friends and acquaintances often ask about the films, Parasite or Train to Busan, TV shows, Squid Game or Extraordinary Attorney Woo, boy band BTS or global hit Gangnam Style. They also ask about North Korea in general, or the Kim family in particular, Pyongyang's latest nuclear test or tirade against Seoul and Washington, the country's latest economic problems, or the regime's latest execution. The point is that there is growing interest in the two Koreas, which seems to have no end. even in countries that in the past focused their attention elsewhere. Listeners may still wonder what led us to write this book. Sure, our work focuses on Korea, and we have personal links with the country, but so do many others. We do have an answer to that question. Simply put, we believe that there is a need for a book grounded in academic research that is accessible to the general public. The modern history of Korea, pre- and post-division, has gone through many twists and turns. This can make it difficult to follow. With this book, we hope to provide a detailed and analytical introduction to Korean history so that they can gain deeper knowledge about where North and South Korea currently are and why they are there today. Both Koreas have become well known globally, albeit for very different reasons. Our hope is that with this book, listeners will be able to understand why this is the case. We do not wish to claim that Korea and the Koreans are misunderstood, but we do think that they are less understood than comparable countries, whether in Asia or in the West. Take the case of North Korea. A common question that we are asked is why it is the most isolated country in the world as of 2023. Facile explanations such as the character of the Kim family ruling the country since its establishment, or Korea's past history as a hermit kingdom, do not hold. We have to look beyond them. Or take the case of questions we are often asked about South Korea, such as why its culture seemingly came out of nowhere to become globally recognized, or how it was able to go from poor to rich in the span of only 3 decades. As we discuss in this book, the roots of these developments lie in the modern history of Korea. In other words, Korea and the Koreas may not be misunderstood, yet we need a book that allows us to understand them better. This is our aim here. We argue that Korea's modern history has been an odyssey driven by inexorable forces of geography, power, and resilience. To put it simply, Korea, both North and South, has been victim of its own geography, sandwiched in the middle of the great states of East Asia and beyond. It has navigated balance of power politics, however, and has demonstrated an uncanny resilience. Whether this is North Korea surviving a famine that killed up to 10% of its population in the 1990s, or South Korea recovering from the financial crisis in 1997, Korea and Koreans have found a way to survive, and in some cases, thrive. And how have Korea and the Koreans resisted and thrived against all odds? In this book, we argue that there is no single explanation. Over time, unified Korea, South and North Korea, and the Koreans living on both sides of the 38th parallel have evolved. However, we do believe that Korea has grown stronger when its people and its leaders have had a sense of common purpose and have remained united, as was the case in North Korea throughout the 1960s to 1970s, or in South Korea's post-Asian financial crisis. Conversely, we argue that Korea has been at its weakest when internal divisions have allowed outside powers to exercise their influence, as was the case in the early 20th century, leading to colonization by Japan. And sometimes, certainly, divisions between the people and the leaders have resulted in a stronger Korea, such as the democratization process in the 1980s in the South. In this book, we recount this story in unique and novel ways, drawing from personal experiences in and around US, Asian and European governments, oral interviews, journalistic accounts, and traditional research materials. We believe that this new history of Korea we have penned is different from any other because we view it from American, Korean, and European perspectives. In this sense, this transatlantic collaboration is a first for a history book on Korea. 1. Balance of power politics and the occupation. The 19th century to 1945. It is customary for guests at the White House, who are there for a meeting with the President of the United States, to wait in the Roosevelt Room. Sitting diagonally across the hallway from the Oval Office, it is a windowless meeting space that was originally the office of Theodore Roosevelt when the West Wing was built in 1902, and thereafter expanded by Franklin Delano Roosevelt FDR. Portraits of both presidents hang on the north and south walls. On this particular occasion, Victor Cha was escorting a high-level South Korean official for a meet-and-greet with the president. As is so often the case with the US president, it was a busy day, and he was about 10 minutes behind schedule. As the visiting party was held in the Roosevelt Room, the White House protocol officer cheerfully offered the guest and his 3-person entourage a quick tour of the historic room. Our guest politely accepted, and the protocol officer proceeded to talk about the history of the room and about how President Nixon named it after Teddy Roosevelt in 1969. She then explained the tradition of how Republican administrations would hang Tadej Steiker's Rough Rider portrait of their party's Roosevelt over the mantel, and Alfred Jonio's portrait of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, FDR, on the south wall. When the Democrats held the White House, the portrait positions would be switched. This stopped with Clinton. As she walked us around the meeting table in the center of the room to the closed door opposite the Oval Office, we stood in front of a small glass-encased gold medal suspended on the wall. The protocol officer explained proudly that this medal was the Nobel Peace Prize awarded to Teddy Roosevelt for brokering the Treaty of Portsmouth that ended the Russo-Japanese War. While the protocol officer was smiling, Victor looked for a reaction from the guest. For Koreans, Roosevelt's Nobel Prize is synonymous with the US selling out Korea to Japan, after a secret agreement made between Washington and Tokyo, granting Japan a sphere of influence over Korea in return for a US sphere of influence over the Philippines. The guest nodded attentively, affixed his gaze on the medal, then moved on, glancing at his watch. The meeting with the president went as planned, but days later, a left-wing South Korean news website's incorrect report stole the headlines. The article cited an unnamed source who stated that the White House insensitively displays in the Roosevelt Room a copy of the secret Taft-Katsura Agreement that led to Japan's colonization of Korea. As untrue as this was, it spoke to the raw emotions that still surround this period in history. Korea's history is its geography. It is a 680-mile-long, 220-mile-wide mountainous peninsula attached to 2 great powers in Asia, China and Russia, and which juts out across the sea to another, the Japanese archipelago. This location, combined with Korea's relatively smaller size in the region, perennially encourages geopolitical designs by the great powers to dominate Korea. For centuries, China sought influence over Korea to protect its rear flank against aggression. For centuries, Japan valued Korea as a land bridge to continental Asia. And for centuries, Russia defended a smaller border of Korea than China, but coveted the peninsula's ice-free ports to the Pacific Ocean. Even today, these geopolitical impulses, however muted by modernity and development, will always be a part of Korea's story. China was the first to gain influence over Korea from the 7th century, making it a satellite of China's civilization. Korean culture, philosophy, and customs were heavily beholden to China for centuries. The Mongols rolled into Korea in the 13th century and ravaged the country for 100 years, using it as a base of operations to attack Japan. China returned to dominate the peninsula from the 14th century, and Korea became once again a tributary of the Middle Kingdom, and one that wholly adopted Chinese ways of art, culture, and philosophy, which some have described as a Korea that was more Confucian than Confucius. This was a period of great civilization for Korea that lasted 150 years until it was disrupted by Japan. The samurai armies of Toyotomi Hideyoshi invaded in 1592 for several years, during which the Japanese robbed Korea of many treasures, artworks, and cultural artifacts. With the help of China, Koreans fought to expel the invasion, but then the country closed in on itself, even as it stayed tied to China. Seeking to avoid the turmoil of its region, Korea became known as the Hermit Kingdom. Korea had a king in 1864, but he was only 12 years old. The country, governed by a dying dynasty in its last throes, was run by the father of King Kojong, Yi Ha-ung, or the Taiwan-gong, as the de facto regent. He ruled for a tumultuous decade between 1864 and 1873, when Korea was racked by internal dissent and external predation. Korea had a population just shy of 10 million and boasted a neo-Confucian society that was rich in culture but socially stratified. Yangbang were the privileged landowners and officials of the country. The Zhongying were the noble class of technicians, artisans, engineers, doctors and musicians. The Sangmin were the commoners who lived as farmers, labourers and the military. The lowest class were the Chongin, whose place in life ranged from slaves to criminals. The people in leadership of the country debated fiercely over how best to strengthen the country. While China and Japan had opened to the West in the mid-1800s, the Taiwan-gong and traditional Confucianists, including Yangbang and the Zhongying, wanted to maintain the hermit kingdom, isolating Korea from the modernization waves of the Western barbarians. This reject heterodoxy, support orthodoxy school rebuffed Western demands for trade relations and saw Catholicism's appeal to commoners as a threat to rule. The Hermit Kingdom rejected overtures by ships arriving from England in 1832, France in 1846, Russia in 1854, and the US in 1866. In the last case, an American trading ship, the General Sherman, was destroyed by fire and its crew massacred. Countering this orthodox school were forces for enlightenment who advocated for an open-door policy to the outside world. These progressives, including the commoner classes and some sections of the Yangbang and royal family, yearned for a strong and independent Korea and believed the only way to achieve this was through reformation of the existing socio-economic system. As early as 1862, these forces launched a revolt against the existing hierarchical social structures and unequal economic system. The revolt would be quelled, but more would follow over the following decades. Elites sympathetic to the situation of the lower classes promoted the opening of schools to educate the population, advocated for the use of easier-to-learn Hangul instead of Chinese characters, called for the abolition of slavery, or advocated for lower taxes on the peasantry. They were impressed by Japan's modernization and wanted Korea to adopt Western technologies, convert to Christianity, and open relations with Japan and the United States. The end of the Taiwan-gong's rule in 1873 led to more debates about progressive reform divided between those who pushed for complete opening and those traditionalists who wanted to adopt Western technology but maintain traditional Korean values, so-called Eastern ways, Western machines. In the end, the royal family supported changes to existing structures, abolishing slavery and building new infrastructure, but the reforms were too little, too late. The internal strife had weakened Korea, and by then Japan has become the ascendant power in Asia. Korea faced a choice in the late 19th century. On the one hand, the country could follow China in opposing foreign intervention, keeping its traditional organization of the economy, politics and society, and more generally, closing itself to the outside world. On the other hand, Korea could follow Japan in accepting the arrival of Western powers to East Asia, pursuing a policy of industrialization and changes to society and politics, and, essentially, opening to the changing world around the Korean peninsula. The decision that Korea made would determine the fate of the country. The balance of power in 19th century East Asia. Japan had always seen the territory of Korea as important to gaining a foothold on mainland Asia. In 1876, Japan exhorted Korea to sign the Kangwa Treaty. The ostensible purpose of the treaty was to gain access to Korean ports for trade, but the most important strategic aspect was its role as the first step in Japan's designs to open up Korea. By executing the first Western-style treaty with Korea, Japan was able to deal with Korea as an independent sovereign state and thereby challenged China's traditional dominance on the peninsula. The Kangwa Treaty created concerns on the part of the Chinese, who, in 1882, dispatched about 4,500 troops to the peninsula. This in turn created resistance among reform-minded nationalists who wanted to assert Korean independence from China and inspire change akin to Japan's Meiji Restoration for their country. The resulting Kapsin coup of 1884 pitted Japan-backed modernizers like Kim Ok-yun, who learned from their time abroad of Korea's desperate need to modernize, against China-backed Confucian traditionalists. The internal chaos led to a direct clash of forces between China and Japan on the peninsula. The Convention of Tientsin in 1885 managed to stave off escalation into a wider conflict temporarily as both sides agreed to withdraw troops and provide prior notification of any future intervention. In spite of the agreement, both China and Japan still vied for power on the Korean peninsula. In 1894, the Dongguk Rebellion, a peasant uprising against poor economic conditions, corruption of the Joseon Yi dynasty royalty, and foreign interference, prompted both powers to set foot on the peninsula again, this time with troops. The ensuing Sino-Japanese War reflected a classic power transition war between the rising challenger and the declining hegemon, which Japan won. The Treaty of Shimonoseki in 1895, drafted by a former American Secretary of State, John W. Foster, required China to acknowledge the formal independence of Korea. After disposing of Chinese influence in Korea, widespread modernization policies inspired by Japan came to the country known as the Kaba Reforms. The unpopularity of these measures in some segments of society, including the Top Knot Edict, requiring Koreans to cut off the traditional top knot and don Western attire, provided the opportunity for Russia to gain influence to pursue their traditional interests on the peninsula. Most important for Tsar Nicholas II was access to warm water ports for commerce and for build-up of a navy commensurate with the Russian Empire's status as one of the largest territorial powers in the world. After the Japanese conspired with a Korean faction in the assassination of Queen Min in October 1895, King Ko-jong looked to Russia for safety, moving under the cover of night to the Russian legation along a path that now constitutes the back wall of the U.S. ambassador's residence in downtown Seoul. The Russians provided protection to the Korean king for nearly a year, thereby cementing a position on the peninsula close to the leadership. Japan, which already felt threatened by Russia's support of China in the Sino-Japanese War and its participation in the Triple Intervention, requiring Japan to return the Liaodong Peninsula to China, entered into negotiations, and, in an omen of things to come, the two parties even considered a division of Korea into spheres of influence at the 38th parallel. However, in the end, Japan could not countenance a challenge to its influence in Korea, and staged a surprise attack on the Russian Navy at Port Arthur in February 1904, eventually sinking every Russian ship in the Navy's Pacific Fleet, and then pushing the Russians out of Manchuria. The Russo-Japanese War was the first victory of an Asian power over an Occidental power. It was also one of the first wars where the number of battle deaths outnumbered that of deaths by disease, and constituted a tremendous source of pride for Japan. Russia conceded defeat to Japan at the Treaty of Portsmouth in 1905. The peace agreement, mediated by U.S. President Theodore Roosevelt, gave Japan control of Korea, southern Manchuria, and the southern half of Sakhalin Island. Roosevelt persuaded Japan not to demand an indemnity from Russia in pressing for a final peace agreement. For Koreans, what mattered most about this settlement was the prior secret agreement between Secretary of State William H. Taft and Japanese Foreign Minister Katsura Taro, in which the U.S. agreed to concede any interest in Korea in exchange for Japan recognizing a U.S. sphere of influence in the Philippines. The ultimate importation of European balance of power politics to Asia where great powers traded the fates of smaller ones, the Taft-Katsura Agreement is still remembered in Korea as profound betrayal by the United States, even as the peace treaty won Theodore Roosevelt.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?